Good evening, everyone. We have a chorus tonight. Good evening, everyone. Let me introduce you to Mr. Franz Joseph, Stephen Paulus. He was either Beethoven, Haydn, or Paulus. I'm assuming you're Mr. Paulus.
That's true,
yes.
Yeah. If I wasn't my royalties would be a lot higher.
Yeah, 108 symphonies later, you know, and you still look great, by the way. Anyway, welcome to all of you. It's so nice to see you. We continue with our wonderful series of concerts, and we continue bringing living composers. Who knew that music is still being composed as we speak? Classical music is growing, and here in Nashville, we are expanding the repertoire. We continue to champion, to commission, to perform the war horses of today and tomorrow. And you're going to take ownership of this. I've told you this. You're a huge part of this because this is basically your music. And to add to this, we are recording once again. So your spirit will be there. Yes, we need your energy. When you're there, you make us fear a little bit more. So we play a little bit more on the edge of our seats. But trust me, without you, performances sometimes tend to be a little cold. And of course, having the composer here makes things just a little bit scarier. But I have to tell you, it's a great joy for me to welcome these amazing legends, in my opinion, musical legends. And Stephen and I go back about 10, 12 years. When I was associate conductor in the Minnesota Orchestra, Stephen lives in St. Paul. We met back then, and ever since I became music director of the Nashville Symphony, he was one of the first composers I've been wanting to bring here and to champion his music and introduce them to our wonderful audience here in Nashville. So with that said, welcome. It's nice to see you. I know you mentioned the orchestra had performed one piece of yours before, correct?
Yes, and I've been trying to think of that for 2 days now. I'm embarrassed that I can't. It was memorable. I just can't. It was about 7 years ago. But it was a piece, and Carlos Miguel Prieto conducted it. And I know it was not just a mere bagatelle, but for the life of me, I don't know. You know,
we'll look it up. Don't worry. We'll find out by tomorrow. Well, tonight we're actually performing two works by Mr. Paulus. One of them, which makes me very proud, which is called Three Places of Enlightenment, which is actually a very unusual concerto for string quartet. We're normally using, piano, violin, but in this case, it's an entire string quartet. So that in itself is unique. Plus, the soloists, all here from Nashville. We're utilizing some of the superstars within the orchestra. In this case, Jun Iwasaki, our concertmaster, Carrie Bailey, our principal second, Reinker, our principal violist, and LaMarchina, our principal cellist. And for me, this is a wonderful way of not only showcasing a great piece, but in the same token, since we're recording, showcasing our amazing talent that is a part of the Nashville Symphony day-to-day and who, on every performance, they always hit it out of the park. So a title like Three Places of Enlightenment, I mean, that is a mouthful, I guess, to sort of like, can you give us a hint of what the music is about, where the idea came, and how the commission came about?
Sure. The commission originated with Bill Pussel, who's a concert master in the Cleveland Orchestra now. And at the time this happened, 1995, well actually the year before, because it took me a while to write it, he called me up and he said, how would you like to do a concerto? And I said, great, because I had written one violin concerto for him when we were all in Atlanta in the late 80s and early 90s. He said, no, not a violin concerto, a concerto for string quartet and orchestra. And there was kind of a pause on my end as I thought about that. And I decided, well, maybe that could work. So the piece was commissioned by a businessman in Cleveland, Richard Bogomoni, in honor of his wife, Patricia. And it presented some unique problems. But I think we solved most of those. And the title, Three Places of Enlightenment, was taken from the fact that the piece is kind of a psychological tone poem. And the first, it's written for, I don't write program music, but this piece in a way has a program, if nothing else, of somebody's mind, which it probably was mine since I wrote it. But what happens is the first movement is called From Within. And it takes the idea of someone looking at a problem or a situation or a state of mind, and it's all inside, and I find personally, those are some of the most combustible times when your head is just kind of like playing around with you, whatever. So it's rather violent in a way, wouldn't you say?
Sure, I'll say so.
Well, there's the opening thing from the orchestra. There's there are drums, timpani, tom-toms, and then all of a sudden the orchestra comes in. It sounds like a theme from the Slasher or something. It's like clonk and then clonk and then clonk, 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 and then it gets slightly more lyrical. The middle movement is called From Afar, and it's a quieter movement. You know, I could have called it fast, slow, fast. That didn't seem as clever. So I used From Afar, which is like looking at a problem from a distance and having some perspective, but in the mind of the person who's looking at it, being kind of wistful and melancholy. That movement opens up with a little theme that sounds sort of, what would you say, not tonal or something, from the string quartet, but it quickly dives into a very familiar piece. At the time I was writing this, I happened to go to a barbershop quartet convention in Minneapolis, and a group called the Gas House Gang sang a piece called Sweet Hour of Prayer, and I bought the CD. I always liked close harmony. I used to listen to the Beach Boys a lot, and so I decided for some reason or other, maybe because I'm an American composer, and after the sort of violent cacophony of the first movement, that this movement needed to have something very solid and kind of familiar. The words are, I couldn't sing the whole thing for you, but I mean, the words are kind of familiar, and it's in A-flat major, which is contrast to the first thing. So the quartet plays this by themselves, which is the string quartets are a very intimate form of communication. What happens, they only play a part of the tune, and then the strings, the whole string orchestra comes in. And it sounds different. I mean, it's like suddenly you had this very detailed, little intimate thing. Now when you put all the strings on it, it's like some big, warm, fuzzy bandage that's been applied to whatever. And the little Sweet Hour of Prayer works its way back in deceptive little ways. Towards the end of the first movement, there's a little three-note theme that just goes dum, 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 like that. It's just a little teaser. You'll probably hear it, I think, because don't all the string, the quartet, they all play on the same note, even the cello. And I wanted to put everybody on the same note just to, when the cello plays a note that's high up in E, it sounds different than when the viola plays it, and when the violins are playing lower or down, we get different colors. So that appears once in the first movement. And the second movement, it appears in the quartet several times. And at one point, after they finish playing this little three-note theme, just goes dum, 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 dot and a half note, whatever, the orchestra takes it over, and they sort of have a meltdown. And if you're watching carefully, you'll notice that when they get the dum, 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 the pianist has a cacophony of descending clusters. It's like he's a tormented child who has decided to see if he can break the piano, and he's going da, 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 da. And then the piece ends very quietly. Tubular bells or chimes, whatever you want to call it, and harp and tam-tam, so it's very atmospheric and colorful. The last movement has this little three-note theme in it, but not until partway through. And the last movement is again fast, but it's called, let's see, what's it called? Radiating Outward.
Radiating Outward
and
with
from all around or
energy.
Something. It's the idea
Look it
that...
up in the program book. Sorry, Radiating Outward, the illustration's pretty short too, I'm sorry, but I didn't prepare for this. I prepared for Haydn and Beethoven, that's why you're here.
I wanted to combine the idea of something interior, like the first movement, from within, the other one, from afar, so I thought radiating outward, something, whatever it is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There will be a test, remember. We're going to skip that. That's going to be extra credit.
But one of the unique problems of this piece is, string quartet, if you go to hear just a string quartet concert, you hear the violist do something, and then the cellist, and then the first violin second. It's like string quartets have been defined by somebody as like a dinner party with 4 extremely intelligent, witty guests. And so you've got that problem of, working those 4 people. Now you've got 4 people who all want to be the soloists, and they can't, one can't play all the solo parts. You got to divide that up, and you got to combine violin and cello.
Without hurting feelings.
Well, it's hard not to do that, at any rate. And then you have this backup band of 98 players who didn't come there just to go, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So, and there's certainly not a backup band on this piece, because that's the other thing I wanted to do is you know, you've got an orchestra, and a great orchestra like the Nashville Symphony, you want them to be able to do something. So surprisingly, the orchestra has these outbursts, and it'll seem like they're playing, there's a lot of loud brass, percussion, and everything, but they're not playing those things when the string quartet is playing. Because the quartet has to be heard, and that again is, you have to treat the quartet almost as one instrument, but it has to have individual personalities come out, and you'll see that when the cellists play something, or the violins play pizzicato or whatever, and then you have to give the orchestra something to do, and you have to make sure that everybody's happy. It's not easy.
Well, a side note, you mentioned that the piece was written for Bill Prusel, who today, he's currently the concertmaster of the Cleveland Orchestra. And like you said, you and him go back many years when you went back in Atlanta. You should know, as a side note, that Bill Prusel's first job as concertmaster, Nashville, when he was 19 years old. He started his career, he's become perhaps the most respected concertmaster, I would say, in the country, perhaps around the world. From here, he went to Utah for a couple of years and then continued for a long period of time in the Atlanta Symphony when Robert Shaw was music director. So all of those great recordings you hear of Atlanta Symphony, most with Shaw, it is Bill Prusel playing concertmaster. But then he had enough of orchestral music and decided to go into chamber music. So he left the orchestra to be a part of the Cleveland String Quartet. And that's when this commission came about. And then he had enough of that. He said, you know what, I want to go back into the orchestral world. So he went on audition for the Philadelphia Orchestra and for the Cleveland Orchestra. And on the same day, he was offered both jobs. And that tells you a little bit about him. And then he accepted the Cleveland Orchestra job, I think. He told me that mostly because of the history of the Cleveland Orchestra. He felt a stronger connection with the music director at the time, Christopher Dochnani. And to add to that, he created in Cleveland Institute of Music perhaps the only academy specifically made for concertmasters. And our current concertmaster, Jun Iwasaki, is actually the first graduate of that concertmaster academy. So you see how many of these things are connected. And in many ways, when I see Jun, I always say, you look like a little Bill Prusel. I mean, they have some of the same traits, and it's obvious that he studied with this great master and learned not only to be an amazing violinist, but remember, to be a concertmaster, there's so much more leadership, administrative duties that only a great concertmaster can teach you. So that there's a little thing in the family in this piece, I think.
Well, what you may not be prepared to tell them is that next week, Giancarlo is conducting the world premiere of my third violin concerto, which the first one was written for Bill Prusel, and the third one is also written for him. And this will be with the Cleveland Orchestra.
Next week.
So,
so we'll be seeing all of each other, not a lot of winners. Another thing I wanted to mention to you about the whole logistics of conducting a string quartet concerto. The first question was, where do we put the quartets? I mean, that was a big question, because it's one thing to have a violinist or a clarinetist, but how do we position 4 players? And we discussed this at length. We talked about maybe having them in front of me, but then they said, no, we need to be closer, like you said, like an entity. We need to be like one voice. So they came up with the idea, what if they were to be where the piano normally is when there's solos? And then I said, well, but that's behind me. You know, that's kind of a little odd, because I still feel like I need to see you and you need to see me. And so we figured out a way that they are right behind me, on the kind of on an arch, so 3 of them can see me from the corners of their eye. The viola player, Dan Reinker, is actually back to back to me. He's actually, all I feel is his back. But it shows you a little bit of how music truly is a connecting and communicating way in the world. That's where telepathy comes in. And to tell you the truth, it's been amazing to me when I conducted this piece. It took some getting used to. I have to share with you. But it is amazing how truly this idea that if we give them the possibility for them to function as one voice, then it's easy for me to know who I have to look for, because they themselves give themselves cue, and then I kind of take it from individual person. At some point, it's like, who do I look for? Who do I look at? But then little by little, without saying what word, I found out who was taking the lead at one individual moment. And that's when I said, you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, because all 4 of them are key. There's 2 violinists, but they're not one and second voice. I mean, both voices are soloistic. And it's going to be very interesting, I think, from your perspective, because I promise you there's going to be many times when you're going to say, how are they getting those cues? Telepathy comes in. And conducting is the only tangible proof that telepathy indeed exists. And tonight I am going to prove that to you. After the intermission, we play another piece of yours. This time, it's a piece written for strings only, called The Veil of Tears, and it's a part of a larger work. You want to talk about that?
Sure. The larger work is an oratorio I wrote called To Be Certain of the Dawn, which premiered in 2005. And it's an oratorio that has themes based on the Holocaust. It's 1 hour long. It's for children's chorus, adult chorus, 4 soloists, a soprano, mezzo, tenor, and a baritone, a shofar player, and full orchestra. And it was commissioned by a large Catholic church, the Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis, in honor of Temple Israel in Minneapolis as a gift. And it's I won't go into the whole thing about the piece, but at this point, 2/3 of the way through the piece, there's been a lot of stuff with voices and a lot of words and a lot of music going on. And what I decided was needed is something just a simple piece only for strings in which people could digest some of the things that they've heard and sort of mourn some of the textual things that have been talked about. So it's about, I don't know, is it 3 minutes long? Or?
It's a very short work, yes, about 3 minutes long.
And during the performance of this at the Basilica, however they do this, people march down the aisles and lit candles so that by the time the piece this section was finished, all 1,500 people in the Basilica were standing with lighted candles. And it was in honor of the memorial Yad Vashem in Israel, where there are these candles and mirrors in honor of the children. And it was a tremendous experience. You can kind of imagine it in your mind, but 1,500 people holding candles, and then you hear this piece. And I thought, this will be the piece that will go also on the recording, and I thought, it's something that could be used by an orchestra anytime they wanted a short piece to play as a memorial for somebody that passed away, an important person in the community, a board member or whatever, or whatever. I think it would work for that, don't you?
Absolutely. It is although the piece is part of a larger oratorio, this one moment, it is so intimate, although it is used by the entire strings, it still feels like it's a very intimate piece because you write very economically. I mean, you write basically, you do a lot of doubling, but it's still very poignant because it's almost, at times, it sounds like the whole orchestra is talking with one voice only, almost like a prayer. And to me, doing this piece, and I've heard, by the way, the entire oratorio, I've heard the entire piece, and that one moment to me is truly magical, and I think you needed that, absolutely, right before there's so much happening in terms not only of the music, but the text as well. It can be quite overwhelming that you need that one moment of solace, and I think that, along with the added bonus of the candles and everything, it really can create an unforgettable moment.
It reminds me a little bit, your music shouldn't remind you of some other composer, but because that's not as a rhythm. But anyway, I was influenced years ago by a piece called the Game Ballet Suite by Cacciatorian, remember?
Yes, of course.
It's a very sad piece, and using the strings in this way, it doesn't sound like the Game Ballet Suite, but
it doesn't sound Armenian to me.
No, but it has some of the same flavor, I guess is all I'm trying to say, and that's a gorgeous, very sad piece. I like that.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for joining us, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy both pieces. I think it is very appropriate that in the same concert that we're doing a string quartet concerto, we are doing a piece by perhaps the father of the modern string quartet, which is Franz Joseph Haydn, Papa Haydn, as he was known. Papa Haydn was not only the father of the string quartet, he was the father of the symphony. He wrote 106, 108, depending on who's counting, 108 or 106 symphonies. You know why that is, though. People didn't want to hear the same piece over again back then. How things have changed. Whenever a piece was done, it's like, okay, thank you, let's move on to the next one. Write me something new. This whole idea that we love this one piece and let's just keep playing it. Back then, you were requested to write something new. In the case of Haydn, he came from the 18th century, at the time when composers, the way of making a living was for working for royalty, working for somebody, being in somebody's household as their Kapellmeister, as their music teacher, as their composer. Nowadays, people have Hummers and Ferraris in their car. Back then, they have orchestras. And whoever had the best orchestra and the best players, you showcased it. Franz Joseph Haydn is perhaps the perfect example of the perfect employee. He worked for the same family for 30 years, for the Esterházy family. Austria-Hungary Empire, particularly on the Hungarian side. Nicholas Esterházy, the first perhaps one of the greatest patrons of music, somebody that truly adored music and who needed music. In the absence of iPads and iPods, if you wanted to play music, you had to play. And in his case, he had an entire orchestra, an entire string quartet, an entire opera company at his disposal, singers and all. And whenever the Count went and whenever Prince Esterhazy went, the whole shebang went with him. At the Summer House, the Winter Palace, the Vienna House, everywhere they went. So Joseph Haydn, imagine, working for 30 years, was the complete opposite of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who managed to upset every employer he had, who managed to burn every bridge. You saw the movie Amadeus. He couldn't get a job, but Haydn, for 30 years, loyal work towards the Esterhazy household. Wrote most of the symphony except the last 20 and the first 10, but everything else in that 30-year period from about 1760s to 1790 was written specifically for the Esterhazy household. The symphony you're going to hear tonight is special because it is called the Hornsignal Symphony. And besides showcasing our wonderful string quartet principles, I also wanted to showcase our wonderful horn quartet in the orchestra. Why is this unusual? Remember that in classical time, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, orchestras were made up of usually 2 French horns. But for some weird reason, in 1763, there were 4 horn players in the Esterhazy household. Don't ask me why. We don't know why. There were, at that one moment, 4 people in the roster paid by the Esterhazy household. So this opened a whole possibilities for Haydn sonically. Imagine writing for 4 horns. That orchestra is going to sound different. He wrote 1 symphony for the 4 horns, actually number 13. Remember that the numbers of the symphony does not match the chronological order. You should know that. 13 and 79 were written the same year. So that's a separate discussion. But symphony number, the one that we know, symphony number 13, was written for 4 horns. Then one of them died. Then there were 3. I did not write anything for 3 horns, even though he started sending letters to Esterhazy. Please, can we replace that 3rd horn? Because, man, I could use that 4th horn. It's amazing. And the prince said, no, not now. I don't have any money. You can relate to that. You know? And that same letter, we also have an idea that Haydn was a wonderful lobbyist for his player. In that same letter, he asked the prince if he would consider paying for the musician's medications, which the prince agreed to, by the way. By some weird thing of fate, somehow in 1765, the prince agrees to hire that 4th player. To celebrate the occasion, Haydn writes yet another symphony for 4 horns. That's the one you're going to hear tonight. And it says, "Thanks be to God" on the title. And to make a case for it, the piece opens with the 4 horns. That is the first thing you're going to hear. You cannot miss it. And tonight we're going to be using a size of an orchestra about the same size that Haydn used when he premiered. 23 players, including me. Most likely at the premiere, there were more people in the orchestra than there were in the audience. It is very likely that for this performance, it was Mr. Esterhazy with a couple of guests. They had dinner. They said, "Let's go hear my orchestra." And there were maybe 4 or 5 people there. We don't know. The piece is from 1765. One way that Haydn attracted great players was not only financially, although that had a lot to do. The prince paid good wages because he wanted the best players. But another way that Haydn convinced players to come to Esterhazy, he would write great parts for them. He would say, "You'll come and I'll write you a concerto, I'll write great solos for you so you will shine." This symphony, besides the great solos for the horn players, there is violin solo, cello solo, flute solo, 2 oboe solo, and a bass solo. Talk about a great way of encouraging the players not to leave. Because again, Haydn was very respected, but if some other prince or some other count offered them more money, can you blame them? So along with that, Haydn would add these little things. The piece is from 1765, but we know the premiere took place before September 13 of 1765. What happened on September 13, 1765? You see, the flute player was out hunting and accidentally shot at a barn and started a fire and was dismissed on that day. And for the next year and a half, there were no flute parts written by Haydn because he could not replace him. That is why we know this symphony must have been premiered before that day. Somewhere in that year, Haydn lobbied very hard, and eventually that player was rehired again. So when you hear this music, imagine for 1 second what it must have been like to hear this piece of music in the intimacy of a salon, in the intimacy of some prince's living room. And by using a very small orchestra, I want to recreate that as best as I can because it is intended to be played truly as chamber music. How do you know this is an early symphony? Because it uses harpsichord. Back then, the early symphonies of Mozart and Haydn included the harpsichord. It was later on that they dropped them. I said, you know what, orchestras got bigger, all of a sudden you couldn't hear the harpsichord. But still in this symphony, you can hear it very, very clearly. From Haydn, we go to perhaps the father of the Romantic period in classical music, and that's Ludwig van Beethoven, and of course, the fifth. There is only one fifth. When we talk about the fifth, we're talking about Beethoven. You know the tune. What is it about the opening of that symphony that is in our psyche, that is unforgettable? It's not a melody. Beethoven was not known for his melodies. I mean, give me a break. That's a melody. Da 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 da, da 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 da. That is not a melody. I'm sorry, it is not. Much has been made about the meaning of the cha-cha-cha-cha. You can go to Mongolia, you go to Antarctica, and they'll recognize it immediately. It stays with us. It has been used even during World War II. Supposedly, it mirrors the Morse code for victory. I never knew if that's really true, but they used it for PR purposes. The piece was played at the first concert of the New York Philharmonic in 1842. It was the first piece ever recorded in its complete version in 1913 by Arthur Nikisch and the Berlin Philharmonic. You can hear that on YouTube, by the way. You should go and check it out. If you can make it up underneath the... It's an amazing testament to how music was played close to 100 years ago. So going back to the piece, Beethoven started writing this thing in 1804, right after he wrote the Eroica. Very tumultuous time in Europe, particularly in Vienna. 1805 would see the occupation of Vienna by Napoleonic armies. Very tense. You can see a lot of tension. Beethoven at this time, they knew that there was something wrong up here. He felt that his hearing was not right. It was little by little, it was becoming very noticeable. The first sketches of the symphony go from 1804. Beethoven had plenty of sketches, lots of he carried around, and whatever idea came up, he would write it down. But then he kind of abandoned those sketches and started working on the Rasumovsky quartets, started writing the fourth piano concerto, and actually started writing what became the fourth symphony. And those original sketches were kind of forgotten until later when he kind of recovered and dedicated himself to writing not only the fifth symphony, but the pastoral as well. The premiere of this piece, along with many other works, took place on December 22nd, 1808, at the Theater an der Wien in Vienna. And the one thing most people remember from that evening is that the heating broke down. December in Vienna, everybody was freezing. Here's the program for the evening. Open with Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, world premiere, followed by A Perfido, concert aria, by Beethoven's first performance in Vienna for soprano and orchestra, followed by the Sanctus movement from the Mass in C major, so I guess a choir must have been there, followed by the fourth piano concerto, first public premiere in Vienna with Beethoven playing. Intermission. Second half, I guess they went to dinner. Second half, world premiere, Fifth Symphony, followed by the Benedictus and Agnus Dei movement from the Mass in C major, followed by improvisations by Beethoven on the piano. He was quite famous at it, by the way. You know, he would have been probably the greatest jazz player had he been alive now. And then, to close the program, world premiere of the Choral Fantasy for piano, 8 soloists, chorus, and orchestra. There's a program for you. Can you imagine that many world premieres in one evening? Oh, and I forgot, one rehearsal for the whole thing. It was not a good night musical, as you can imagine. Even under the best circumstances nowadays, there's no way an orchestra could put all that music together in one run-through. Plus, world premiere, and they didn't have computer printers back then. The parts for these world premieres, you can only imagine the shape this music was in. We take that stuff for granted now when we have everything printed so beautifully. Can you imagine back then? You've seen those feathers and the smudge on the pages, not an F sharp and F natural. You can only imagine. And by the way, you should know that conducting Beethoven Fifth is the hardest thing to conduct for a conductor, by far. You can do the first 4 measures of Beethoven 5 for a conductor edition, and that's all you need to do. If they can conduct those 4 measures without the orchestra falling apart and without saying a word, you're the greatest conductor on earth. It is true. Why is it so difficult? Because it starts on an upbeat. The downbeat, you're going to see me go like this, nothing is going to happen until a millisecond later when the orchestra comes in. That's the problem with this symphony. Everything is after a rest. Ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba. It is so hard to be able to do that because most players are used to doing boom, not boom. It is intuitive. The entire motif, by the way, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, say it with me, da-da-da-da, 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 da-da-da-da. The first 3 measures are a freebie. He's giving them to you, don't forget them. And he's going to give them to you so loud that you will not forget them. Here comes the trick. For the remainder, not only of the first movement, for the remainder of the entire symphony, that motif will appear in some way, shape, or form. Only for the opening, I'm going to give you a freebie. The opening of the second movement, for the first minute and 24 seconds, the motif disappears. You don't look for it. But after a minute and 24, find it. It will be there. It can be soft, it can be loud, it can be upside down, it can be subliminal. Pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam. It's always 3 plus 1, 3 plus 1, 3 plus 1, 3 plus 1. This piece is, in my opinion, the most amazing piece of music ever assembled from from a programmatic point of view. The fact that this entire symphony is literally glued by this motif is a work of absolute genius. There is no melody. There's a couple of hints of melody, but the entire symphony is dependent on those 3 notes. And you as an audience have to be pulling almost what I call the Where's Waldo process. You have to find it. As I said, the opening is given to you free. So Beethoven is saying, okay, here it is. From here on, find it. And sometimes your brain is going to mess up with you. Did I hear it? Did I hear it? Grab the person next to you. Hopefully introduce yourself first. You know? Hey, is that it? Is that it? You have no idea what it means for a conductor, for myself, to be doing a piece of this magnitude, because it is so well known, it is also the scariest thing to do. But once you find it where it is obvious to me that only a person of Beethoven's genius could have pulled this trick, because it is a trick. Can you imagine putting a piece together, 31 minutes long, where everything is literally glued by 4 notes? Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Fast, low, loud, soft, brass, winds, timpani, basic. It's everywhere. These are indeed the 4 most famous notes in the universe.